A year and a half after release, I think it's safe to say that the PlayStation Classic was a failure. Now, settle down, children, settle down. Compared to Nintendo's offerings, the PlayStation Classic simply couldn't measure up. I remember seeing them in my local game store, and I felt like every time I'd go in, I'd see the price was just marked down further and further. Once it dipped below $50, I was finally tempted enough to give it a shot. After playing it for a bit, I quickly discovered why it was heavily discounted so quickly. I'd like to take you on a journey throughout the history of PlayStation, uncovering what made the original PlayStation 1 so successful, and why Sony ultimately failed to recapture the same magic with the PlayStation Classic. PlayStation is one of the largest players in the game industry. No pun intended. The PlayStation 2 is, to this day, the best-selling game console ever released, with the original PlayStation also being among the top. However, Sony wasn't always a major player in the industry. In fact, the origin of the PlayStation was the result of a collaboration between Sony and Nintendo. At the time, the CD had gained quite a deal of popularity as a media format. There was growing interest in the game industry for manufacturers to change over from more traditional cartridge-based systems to CD. The CD allowed for a much larger amount of storage for a lower price, allowing game developers to add things like voice acting, more detailed sprites, and textures. Sony, having helped create the format, was eager to assist Nintendo to create an attachment for the SNES that would allow the system to use CDs. Nintendo would ultimately back out of the deal, opting to work instead with Philips, a deal that would lead to some of the more infamous games of the era. Sony attempted to go to Sega with their developments, but they too wanted no part of what Sony had to offer, as they had already developed their own CD-ROM system, the Sega CD. Not satisfied with letting all their work go to waste, Sony decided to turn their efforts into making a system of their own, a system that would go on to be called the PlayStation. Focusing on power, 3D graphics, and the ability to play CDs, Sony pushed the technical prowess of the PlayStation hard. They had a technical advantage over both Nintendo and Sega, whose existing 16-bit consoles were only capable of limited 3D graphics. While the PlayStation was also more than capable of outstanding 2D graphics, Sony decided their focus should be on their advantage in the third dimension. While both Sega and Nintendo would each release 3D-capable systems, the Saturn around the same time as the PlayStation, and the Nintendo 64 2 years later, it's clear looking at the sales numbers who had the most success in the transition to 3D. Jumping ahead to the modern world, we look at Nintendo. The failure that was the Wii U has put the company into deep financial trouble. With 3DS sales winding down, and the Wii U all but completely stalled out, talk began of the company potentially needing to exit the hardware market altogether. Nintendo was in need of a success, and fast. They needed to think outside the box. Their efforts led them to developing and releasing the NES Classic, a small, Linux-powered replica of the NES that could play a selection of games in high definition. For $60, the price of a single AAA game, you could buy a system capable of playing 30 NES games. Its popularity led to shortages and high markup from resellers, eventually pushing Nintendo to follow up with the even more successful Super Nintendo Classic. Although internally identical to the NES Classic, the Super Nintendo Classic also came with a second controller, the likely cause of that higher $80 price tag. Both systems used custom-developed emulation software created by Nintendo, and were widely praised by reviewers as the definitive way to play these retro games, even managing to provide a better experience than what you could get on Virtual Console. Not one to ever miss out on an opportunity created by Nintendo. That's right, I'm looking at you, PlayStation Move. Sony saw an opportunity to capitalize on nostalgia for their own system as well. 2 years following the release of the NES Classic, they would release the PlayStation Classic to middling reviews. For $100, you got 20 games, 2 controllers, and obviously, the system itself. The higher cost likely a result of a combination of the more powerful components, as well as some licensing issues Sony likely dealt with. Being the highest price for a classic system yet, things did not look good for the PS1 Classic when it would finally hit the market. One of the main critiques of the system at launch was the game selection. Cornerstone PlayStation franchises such as Gran Turismo, Spyro, and Tomb Raider, to name a few, were absent from the system. Instead, Sony likely tried to appeal to the more modern PlayStation audience by including games such as Persona. Out of the top 20 best-selling PlayStation 1 games, only Final Fantasy VII, Metal Gear Solid, and Tekken 3 would make the cut. PlayStation icons such as Lara Croft, Crash Bandicoot, and Spyro were all but absent from the Classic system. Sony's issues with game selection didn't end merely at what games they chose to include or not include on the system. For some reason, Sony opted to use the PAL version of nearly half the games, regardless of what region they released the Classic in. In regions that use the PAL broadcast standard, TVs refresh at 50 Hz rather than the 60 Hz more commonly found in the NTSC regions. The PAL versions of games weren't usually programmed any differently. Rather, the game just ran more slowly to match the refresh rate of the television. By using the PAL version of a game in countries that didn't originally use it, it created a sluggish experience for players in North America, where gamers were more accustomed to an additional 17% performance. The sluggish feeling of the system was only exacerbated by the fact that Sony, regardless of how much hardware they threw at it, couldn't get the performance up to par. They used a version of the open source PCSX emulator to play games. While on its own not a problem, PCSX is the gold standard for PlayStation emulation after all. Sony likely did leave some performance on the table by opting to not use a custom designed emulator for the task. Another oft-criticized aspect of the PlayStation Classic was the price, or to put it more accurately, the value for the price. For $100, it was the highest price yet for a Classic system, yet you got a subpar emulation experience that simply didn't live up to the standards set by others. The more powerful hardware included in the PlayStation Classic by Sony never had a chance to show its potential, handicapped by the fact that they used slower ROMs even though faster ones are available. Being able to play your favorite PlayStation 1 games how you remember them simply isn't possible on the PlayStation Classic. As a consequence, the PlayStation Classic failed. Hard. Sony has a lot of lessons that they could take away from the failure of the PlayStation Classic. By matching game versions to the regions that they sold the Classics in, most complaints about performance would be completely eliminated. Whatever weaknesses remained in the system could be covered by Sony opting to instead develop their own emulator. Again, PCSX is fine as an emulator, but with all the resources and documentation Sony has, developing a PlayStation 1 emulator shouldn't be a major task. Hell, the PSP could emulate PlayStation 1 games just fine. Most importantly, Sony has a value problem with the PlayStation Classic. 20 games for $100, but with so many top-selling games missing, the eclectic mix they did offer didn't appeal to most people, especially with remasters of Spyro and Crash releasing right around the same time as this Classic system did, which definitely wasn't a reason why they were absent on the system. Ultimately, on its own, the PlayStation Classic is a fine emulator box, but definitely not worth Sony's suggested retail price. If you can still find one for $50 or less, I'd say give it a shot. There's plenty of ways to also add more games to the system through questionably legitimate means that I won't go into too much detail here, but suffice to say that you can add much more than just PlayStation 1 games to the system should you decide to go that route. But if you decide to keep it stock, keep in mind the choices Sony made when you decide to hand over your money for it. Games might not run how you remember. Games you love might not even be there. These are all sacrifices Sony chose to make when they made the console, and all sacrifices that also led to its untimely demise. If you've made it to the end, I'd like to take a moment to thank you for watching. This is my first video with this format, and I've still got a lot to learn and figure out about making videos like this, but I'm excited for what the future holds for this channel. If you have any ideas or suggestions, feel free to leave a comment, and I'll do my best to explore whatever topics you guys might like to see. And please, don't forget to subscribe, like the video, and share it to anyone else that you might think like it. Again, thank you.